Welcome, everyone, to our Lift Every Voice book club, monthly book club on contemplative voices of color. We are really thrilled this month to be exploring Howard Thurman, and particularly his book, Meditations of the Heart. Last month, we had a great conversation with April Yamasaki and her book, Four Gifts on Self-Care, which we really enjoyed, and we've loved seeing all the engagement this month in the Facebook group. And I'm delighted to welcome with us, since we can't have Howard Thurman join us in person, I'm delighted that Lerita Coleman Brown has agreed to join us. She has a special love for Howard Thurman. And Lerita is a retired professor of psychology from Agnes Scott College, but she currently serves primarily as a spiritual companion, a retreat leader, and a writer. And she's also written her own book, When the Heart Speaks, Listen, Discovering Inner Wisdom, which is about her journey with heart transplant and sort of looking, I think, at the literal heart and the metaphorical heart, right, Lerita? So thank you so much, Lerita, for being with us. And maybe you could give us a little more introduction to yourself and how you came to love Howard Thurman.
I've been very curious about spirituality in general, I think. Ever since I was a little girl and I would sit out, I would be drawn to the wind and I would like to whenever I saw the leaves swaying out there, I would like to go out in the backyard and just sit in it. And I think my family thought I was a little strange, but uh, because they were wondering what I was doing. And of course I wasn't doing anything. I was really, I think, a contemplative, but didn't have a name for it at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And I think along with my interest in psychology, particularly as I went to college, the interest in spirituality grew as well. And so just been studying a lot of things for many years. And it really wasn't until about maybe 15 years ago that I ran across Howard Thurman. And I was both thrilled and appalled at the same time because thrilled, of course, that I had discovered this amazing treasure of spirituality and mysticism and all the kinds of things that I think we're speaking of these days, and at the same time appalled that I had gone so far into my life and not discovered him.
Yeah.
And I began to ask other people, well, do you know about Howard Thurman? And they would say no. And so it became sort of a personal mission as well as just getting some signs that I was supposed to be out there exposing him to more people.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I would say for the last 10 or 15 years, that's been my calling to share him and to share as much of his wisdom as I can with others.
It's a lovely journey. I get that appalled feeling because I felt the same way when I was reading this book, that how have I not been immersed in his wisdom sooner in my life? So anyway, I'm grateful for the chance to make up for lost time now. Would you be able to tell us a little bit about Howard Thurman's kind of the arc of his journey in his life, just kind of a brief sketch and a little bit maybe about how Quaker spirituality impacted his life, because I think that was a significant.
Well, or that it sort of affirmed in
Mm-hmm.
part some of what
Okay.
he was doing. So Howard Thurman was born on November 18th, 1899, in near Palm Beach, Florida. Although he was raised in Daytona Beach, Florida, he lost his father when he was about 7 to pneumonia, and so was raised primarily by his grandmother and his mother. He had an older sister and a younger sister. And I think being a young, dark skinned boy growing up in the Jim Crow South at that time was pretty difficult. Difficult is the understatement. But he was extraordinarily sort of a sensitive type. And so he basically says that, rather than to get sort of caught up in all of that, he turned inside to God,
Mm.
which is extraordinary. I mean, he basically was meditating when he was probably like 7 or 8. And also at a very young age, he was having mystical experiences. walking along the beaches of Daytona Beach, um, taking in the stars and the moon at night, and feeling like he was a part of that. And of course, he had an oak tree in his backyard, which is still there, by the way. And he used to sit under the oak tree and talk to the oak tree. And he felt like this oak tree was supporting him, and he wanted to be like the oak tree, which is no matter what kind of storms came through, he could hold his ground. And he was actually, in terms of spirituality, probably most influenced by his grandmother, who had been born a slave. And she didn't talk much about that, but she did talk a lot about how once a year the slave preacher would come through and give a sermon, and he would always end with telling them that they weren't slaves and they weren't the N-word, they were holy children of God. And he would always tell that story to him and his sisters whenever she felt like they were sort of losing their confidence or, feeling badly about their second-class citizenship during that time period. But he was very, very bright, did very well in school. And unfortunately, at the time, colored children could only go up to the 7th grade, which basically de facto eliminated high school for them. But his community got together and had someone to tutor him so that he could then go on to the Florida Baptist Academy, where he excelled, became valedictorian of his class, left there, went on to Morehouse College in Atlanta, excelled, and graduated valedictorian of that class. It said that he read every book in the library at the time. I don't know if it's really true or not, but and then went on to Colgate Rochester Seminary, and also graduated #1 in his class in that group. And shortly after graduating, he took a position, his first appointment at the Mount Zion Baptist Church in Oberlin, Ohio. Took some courses at Oberlin while he was there. One night, though, he was at a meeting on religious education, got a little bored, went outside to get some fresh air, and noticed this book on a table called Finding the Trail of Life. And it had been written by Rufus Jones, who was a renowned Quaker mystic at the time. He just sat down and read the whole book right then and decided that whoever wrote the book, he needed to study with them, needed to talk with them. So somehow he secured a semester-long study and the finances for that with Rufus Jones at Haverford College. Wow. For a semester. And that was really his, he was doing all these practices, the meditation, the mystical experiences, but he had not had any formal training or exposure to, mystical traditions. So, he got to study Meister Eckhart and St. Teresa of Avila and St. John the Cross and St. Francis Assisi and, all the sort of, Christian mystics that we normally are exposed to. And learned about a different kind of mysticism that many Quakers practice, which is called affirmation mysticism. So it's one in which you're not, and it's in contrast to what they would call negation mysticism, where you remove yourself, you're living in a cloistered community, etc. Affirmation is really you're going inside to come up inside of community or inside of others. And so really very ethically based and a sense of that in wanting to become a part of the oneness, you need to remove all the barriers between you and others, which would then mean to begin to remedy any of the injustices that you see around you. So, he really benefited from that time with Rufus Jones. But I think Rufus Jones really affirmed for him, you are on the right path. This is the way you want to go. He then moved to Atlanta, spent a couple of years teaching at Morehouse and Spelman College, then secured an appointment at Howard University as the dean of the Rankin Chapel, as well as a professor of religion. In 1935, led a pilgrimage to India with his wife, Sue Bailey Thurman, along with another couple. They spent 6 months over there giving all kinds of lectures. And he met with Tagore as well as with Gandhi, had a very extensive conversation with Gandhi. And there's actually a book just on that called Visions of the New World, Howard Thurman's Pilgrimage to India, written by Quentin Dixie and Peter Eisenstadt. It's a lovely book, and it just sort of talks about what led up to that pilgrimage, the 3 or 4 hour meeting he had with Gandhi, and sort of the aftermath. And so it was really through Howard Thurman that these notions of civil disobedience and nonviolence were brought back to the United States. Even though I think a lot of times we think of the story being very different, but that's basically it. And then, of course, came back. While he was there, he had a vision at Khyber Pass, where he saw a caravan going into Afghanistan, and felt like he was one with those people. And so he wanted to come back and test the notion that people of different religions and faith traditions could come together and worship the same God. So in the early 40s, he received an invitation to begin a church in San Francisco, the Church of the Fellowship of All Peoples, which was the first intentional multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-denominational church.
Wow.
And it was really an extraordinary, place, and had quite a few at-large members like Eleanor Roosevelt. It was amazing. And then, of course, he then received an invitation to become the first Black faculty member and dean of the Marsh Chapel at Boston University, which is, he accepted and retired from there in 1965. So this is sort of the highlight.
Yeah, yeah. No, I'm glad to hear that.
There's many nuances in there, but yeah, sort of give you the shorter summary of his life. Yes.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah.
Was it my?
Yeah.
Okay. So Thurman writes, sometimes the urgency is too great, the pain growing out of the need so overwhelming that the anguish and frustration spill over into a cry, which in itself becomes a judgment and startling accusation. How long shall I cry for help and thou wilt not hear? I cry to thee, violence. So Thurman speaks of the great relief in being able to put into words the quality or the very nuance of need and suffering. With a startling abundance of suffering in the world right now, could you speak to the intersection of raising one's voice and practicing silence?
So what's really fascinating about this particular segment that you read from Meditations of the Heart is that I think Thurman felt like silence was important for not only the renewal of the spirit, but also for one to place themselves under the scrutiny of God, just sort of stripped of all your pretensions, et cetera, and so that you could really see who are you and what are you doing with your life. He was certainly hard on people that were in pursuit of materialism, or just to gain something else from their lives. And so he felt like by practicing silence, you learned more and more of yourself from the inside. And at some point, because he was so connected to the oneness, you had to start paying attention to what was going on around you. That this lifetime is not just about you. Your spirituality is not just about you. That what it should always do is lead you out of yourself to then begin to address those things that you see around you that are unjust. So, I think by going inside, you are able to then find your voice to express that And in what mode are you going to do that? Are you going to write a poem like Amanda Gorman did for the inauguration? Is that going to be your form of provoking others to pay attention? Or is it going to be in a beautiful painting? Or is it going to be in a play or a movie? There's so many different forms of activism. And so what he's saying is that if you continue the practice of silence, eventually you are going to have to face yourself, face your life, and ask yourself, what are you doing? What is your, as he used to call it, a working paper? What are you doing with your life? And you can only go so long without also joining that cry for justice in the world, wherever that might be.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful.
Yeah, and I love that. I love that he makes room for so many different kinds of responses, that it's not just about, say, following the footsteps of, those who protest and, which obviously is an important form of activism, but then there are those of us for whom maybe that's not available for different reasons or not really the call. So yeah, so and I got the sense that for him that his call was less sort of protest oriented and more in this sort of poetic realm of touching people's hearts. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's so true. As a matter of fact, he once said that he felt like the church really should be a spiritual sanctuary for people who, in their activism, came to be renewed. So he actually practiced that. I mean, he knew he was not supposed to be Martin Luther King Jr. That was not his role. And I think the beauty of so much of his wisdom is in helping people understand what is your role. So he had these wonderful, sort of catchphrases like follow the grain of your own wood, or listen for the sound of the genuine in you. Always wanting you to find what your calling is. And so, yes, he was highly criticized for not marching in the street, but he really felt like he was the one who needed to hold the spiritual space for others. And he was quite the spiritual mentor. I mean, I could give you a long list of, people like Jesse Jackson and Vincent Harding and Whitney Young and, Polly Marshall, and the list goes on and on and on of people who would come to him. And he would ask them very deep, penetrating questions about, so what are you doing? And why are you doing this? Because he wasn't just, he was very concerned about the external circumstances, clearly, he knew that people were really suffering, particularly under Jim Crow, because he found it so damaging to their spirits and to the development of identity. But he also felt like, more importantly, creation could not complete itself. We could not move towards the wholeness, towards the oneness, unless we began to address some of these issues. So it wasn't just about racial reconciliation. It was about the restoration of God's beloved creation.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful.
So Lerita, I have another question. My questions are often about race. So I saw this article on CNN with the headline, "We're not seeing more police shootings, just more coverage." So the use of deadly force by the police on Black people is happening so often that we're collectively traumatized. What's worse is that it's videotaped and televised and shared again and again on social media. This onslaught of images of Black bodies being beaten, raped, murdered, and demonized is called by some trauma porn. And it's suggested that it is exceedingly harmful for Black people to consume. So, how do you think Thurman would deal with this idea of trauma porn and minister to those who are continually hurt by it?
Well, first, I think, it's interesting that we're now seeing trauma porn on in social media, he was seeing it firsthand,
Mm.
right? And so, where people couldn't, it was just there. And I think his response to, all of the terror and brutality around him, even growing up in that environment, was to, again, go inside to God. That was, something that he really felt was important. However, Thurman started recording his sermons in the late 1940s. And there are these sort of listening rooms around, where you can go and listen. Of course, now it's digitized and you can go, to websites, etc. But I would think he would be broadcasting some of his sermons on social media.
Mm.
And he would probably suggest to people that you should you should watch enough news to know what you need to know, but no more than that. So, to sort of turn the volume down on that, you don't need to be watching something over and over and over again, particularly something of that nature.
Yeah.
And I think he would probably also suggest that you find a way to express that in some form, whether it's in a song, whether it's in a dance, whether it's in a poem, in whatever way that you see fit, that you need to get that out in some kind of way. So I think he would be very strategic in his use of social media, but it would really be to uplift people. It would not be, to again and again show them things that would, make them depressed or sad or feel bad.
Mm-hmm.
And I suspect that he also would try to find ways, in whatever ways that he could, to help with that healing. He was a person who did not believe that spirituality could be taught, but it could be caught.
Mm.
So he was kind of like a scientist in his, sort of playing around with sort of different forms of religious worship, etc. So, for example, he, had a liturgical dance back in the late 20s and early 30s as part of worship.
Wow.
Really? That's amazing.
Seriously, particularly at Howard, they had like the Vesper service Friday night. It would be packed because they were just wanted to know what he was going to do next, right? So dance, literature. He would bring in poetry and books and all theater, right? But he also was very much into live Madonnas. And so he would, have somebody from the theater department to come up with costumes and lighting. And so you would have actual real women holding real babies.
Wow.
Oh.
So he tried to just do things that would sort of kind of ignite an experience in people. And I should say, he was very creative about the use of silence. Some people complain about these long pauses that he has in some of his lectures and sermons. But in the church in San Francisco, he would sort of give the sermon and just kind of sit down for a while, maybe 10 minutes or so, and just let the silence, let people just soak in what he had to say. And some people came to him and said, we'd like some more silence. And he said, oh, okay. So he actually started having 20 minutes before the service as a meditation period. And some of these meditations, now I think meditations of the heart might be based on the Boston chapel service, but he would have people come early and he would hand out these meditations and let them sit, right, in that for 20 minutes before the service. Well, he found that when he did that, requests for pastoral care went down.
It's amazing.
Because he felt like somewhere in that silence, something might get healed, or something might be revealed or illuminated for someone, so that they didn't really need to come to him.
Yeah.
Because, it's not about him anyway, right? It's always about, God or the spirit or whatever people want to call that. That was what was healing people. But it's really hard um, to receive the benefits of that if you're in a noisy environment, whether that be externally noisy or internally noisy.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why he was always encouraging people to go in, for some silence, or to take some time or a pause for some silence. Because he felt like, and I agree, I think silence is extraordinarily powerful.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, actually, I want to read a quote from him about this kind of interior space that we reach when we rest into silence, because I think the imagery is just gorgeous. He says, there is in every person an inward sea, and in that sea there is an island, and on that island there is an altar, and standing guard before that altar is the angel with the flaming sword. Nothing can get by that angel to be placed upon that altar unless it has the mark of your inner authority. I just found such a remarkable image of the inner altar of our being, the angels that support us, the boundaries that we need to create, the touching into the deep inner wholeness that we are. Anyway, I just wonder if you have any other responses to that image, or other images he had about silence.
Well, I certainly love that one. That's one of my favorite, pieces by him. And, there are a variety of interpretations of that. I certainly felt like it was a call to protect one's inner sanctuary.
Yeah.
So we're constantly being bombarded, certainly whether it's, by the media or even within our own families, that people, perhaps maybe attacking our character or telling us this, that, or the other. And I think it's so important to protect your inner sanctuary, to not take that in, right? But at the same time, some people have written that he was talking about inner wrestling. That is that in that sort of exposure to God, when you begin to see some of your more shadow sides, that it's also a time of, sort of asking yourself, is this who you really want to be?
Yeah.
And do you, should you perhaps maybe not allow this to continue to be a part of your life? So I like mine about the protecting of the inner sanctuary, but because I think that people sometimes feel like they're powerless to control what it is that others believe about them, which is probably true, but you don't have to internalize that. Maybe it's my psychological background, as a psychology professor. And so I know how identities can and selves can be constructed, by the sort of outside world. And at some point you have to ask yourself, am I really that, or am I something else? Does that resonate with who I feel inside? Or did I just internalize what other people told me about myself?
Yeah.
And I think that's so important, especially if you're a person of color, or a member of some kind of minority, and you're getting all this negative, feedback about who you are. It has nothing to do with who you are, just that you've been stereotyped. Well, you don't have to take that in, and you do not have to respond to other people as if you've taken that in. Yeah. It's quite surprising. I know in my own life, people have been quite surprised when I don't come back with what they expect. It's like, we're not negotiating my identity here, okay? So I know who I am, and so we're not doing this. Now, if you want to pretend like I'm somebody else, that's fine, but I'm not going to be that person for you.
Yeah, yeah. I know it feels like silence is such a gift on so many different levels, and yeah, from the discerning who we really are to the discerning of our action in the world and our response to social injustice and racism, and to the just finding that deep space within of sanctuary with the divine. It's it's beautiful.
Lerita, his writing is so powerful and beautiful and even masterful. Who and what influenced the way he writes?
Well, I would say probably one of his biggest influences was Olive Schreiner, Olive Schreiner was a feminist activist in South Africa. She wrote a lot of allegorical tales, and she was quite the figure. I think he was introduced to her when he was in seminary, at least to some of her writing. And he ended up actually editing a book of her writings. It's called Tracks to the Water's Edge. And I think he was so taken with some of her stories that he named his first daughter after her.
Wow.
And so that kind of, I mean, besides the fact that some people are just gifted writers, and I think given all the writing he did, and in part, you know, all the reading that he did, you know, he was sort of a kind of a, I think because he was a real mystic from the beginning, he was kind of a bit of, I won't say a loner, but people weren't always, you know, drawn to him, at least early on. You know, and you can imagine as an adolescent, you know, people are like, he's weird, right? You know, kind of thing. So I think he spent a lot of that time, you know, he's a little socially awkward. He spent a lot of that time reading and, you know, and he actually started writing sermons and giving sermons when he was in college. So, you know, just about what he thought about God or what he thought about Negro ministers or what he, you know, so of course with the writing comes that practice, but I think the particular poetic kind of format to it has a lot to do with Olive Schreiner. One of his first books to be published was called The Greatest of These, and it's really based on, you know, that scripture from Corinthians, but published in 1944 by Mills College Press. And you can sort of see that kind of poetic, sort of allegorical style there. I mean, he certainly read lots of philosophers and, you know, lots of other people. He loved literature. He loved going to the opera. I mean, he was just one of those people that was open to everything. And so, you know, I mean, I probably, you know, some people thought it's fascinating. I was just reading a new biography of him out that's called Against the Hounds of Hell. It's by Peter Eisenstadt, and Peter Eisenstadt is a historian, so it's just so lovely to read because you get the historical context. But you know, he talks a lot about how you know, Thurman just was constantly exposing himself to all kinds of people all over the world, and so you know, he was just continually expounding on not only on his own personal sort of experiences with God, but trying to sort of to give people a sense of that and taking in some of this literature. You'll see it in all of these different parts. Like The Angel with the Flaming Sword is, I think, from another author. And I'm actually trying to track down some papers on just The Angel with the Flaming Sword. Apparently he gave some sermons on just that. So,
Wow.
yeah. Luckily, in the last, I'd say, 2 years, there have been 5 volumes of the Howard Thurman Papers Project published. It's probably got the largest number of papers for an African American. He's second largest to Martin Luther King Jr. So lots of papers, but they've certainly been able to compile a lot of his correspondence and his unpublished lectures or sermons in the Howard Thurman Papers Project. So it's great.
That's fantastic. It's very exciting. I wanted to read this other quote that he has in this book called, where he says, "Look well to the growing edge. All around us, worlds are dying and new worlds are being born. All around us, life is dying and life is being born." I personally love the image of like the wild edges as that fertile place where new life emerges. And I wonder if you have a sense of what the growing edges might be in the world right now. You know, what might Thurman's perspective, obviously through your interpretation, but what are those growing edges, the new worlds, the worlds that are dying and the new worlds that are being born? It's a kind of an exciting image.
It is. He also has a book with that title, The Growing Edge.
Mm.
I think that Thurman first felt like creation was always evolving. He was just one of those, in some ways, a process theologian who felt like we're not done, right?
Mhm.
So there's lots more to come. But I think probably the real challenge that he would say for most of us is to be able to see every other person as a holy child of God.
Mm.
And of course, then to see yourself as a holy child of God.
Yeah.
In some ways, that being something that might take a lifetime, for you to really come into realization of. And at the end of Jesus and the Disinherited, in the chapter on love, he really says our challenge is to be able to love someone into knowing that they are a holy child of God. Because if they knew they were a holy child of God, they would not be brutalizing anybody. They would not be trying to take advantage of someone. They would be trying to help as many people as they could. But we have lots of people all over the world who have no sense of their own spirituality, know that they are a spirit, know anything about any connection to anything else. And so certainly that would be one, probably the major one. But in addition to that, he was very much into nature, and he felt like he believed in what they call common consciousness, so that there's a certain kind of consciousness that is in us is also in every living being.
Love that.
So he loved to talk to his plants as he talked to the tree. He loved to observe, nature. He for a while was painting pictures of penguins because he thought penguins, and how they deal with their young, etc., was such a model. But he felt like there's this connection to all of creation. So it doesn't just end with people. So I'm sure he would have a lot to say about the environment, including environmental justice.
Yeah. That's really exciting. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, yes. Yes. Yeah. So yeah, he really, he was way ahead of his time.
Yeah.
And he tried to explain, he really felt like mystical experience was not just for people that were considered saints or were in cloistered communities, but that's possible for any person, to have that connection. And he often referred to them as religious experiences, whether the religious experience being outside or part of worship, or you're praying and you have this kind of, unitive or oneness experience with God. But that every time you have one of those, it should change you. So he talks in The Creative Encounter that it's like your brain should be changing. I mean, he was talking neurotheology in the 50s. Wow. I mean, that's what we call it now, but this is the same thing, right? Yeah. But that every time you have an encounter with God like that, it should change you. It should kind of shake something in you, shake up maybe a little bit of that ego or that sense of autonomy, or, so that you, again, everything's moving towards the oneness.
Yeah.
The whole.
Beautiful. It's amazing. Wow. Do you have any other questions, Claudia, that you want to ask?
Taking it all in.
Taking it all in. That's good. Well, I have one more that I definitely wanted to get to before we wrap up this amazing conversation. I feel like I want you to come teach a whole class, which we might have to talk about. But he has this other quote. There's so many quotes that I loved, first of all, and I appreciate Claudia asking about his writing influences, because I just was so taken with his turns of phrase and his poems and his prayers. But he says, every moment is a divine encounter. Every facet is an exposure to the boundless energies by which life is sustained and our spirits made whole. Thus we live joyfully into life and its restraints. And I think I just wanted to maybe ask you to explore a little bit with us, like this vision of joyfulness, a spirituality of joyfulness, particularly in the context of living in the Jim Crow South and in the context of racial violence and all of that. Like what a tremendous gift that is to hold both those and to have the joy. Obviously, the joyful vision is what sustained him and what carried him forward, and it wasn't the other that was winning out. So yeah.
Well, I think one of the deepest desires he had in his heart was for every person to come into some understanding that the external world should not determine your inner life.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think this meditating and talking to the tree, maybe as a child, that at some point he basically says, I hit this place where I realized that no matter what was happening out there, I was going to be okay. You know, I was going to be fine. And I think there is something about either our own experiences or our own spiritual practice where we do have that moment where we connect to something. I know for me as a child, I couldn't name it, but I was very close to the Holy Spirit. I mean, you know, there's just like my buddy, right, that I could sort of turn to when I was kind of in a crisis or something. Just know that there was something there. And I mean, I'm very thankful to my parents for sending my brother and I to Catholic school, mostly for the early orientation of God, because, you know, we prayed all day, right? You know, before recess and after recess and all that, right? So just knowing that there was a God and that, you know, you could actually communicate, right? Not that I had necessarily positive images, because, you know, for me, it was this old white man in the sky frowning most of the time, but that there was a sense that there was something else. And so I think that when you've had that experience where you have that sort of light bulb moment where you realize, oh, there is something else. It can care for me and in some cases protect me. I can interact with it. If I listen deeply enough, it will guide me. If I listen often enough, etc. And for me, especially when I was going through my transplant 26 years ago, that's what got me through, was sort of centering down and listening, you know, and sometimes it would say, call the doctor now, right? Or don't eat that, you know, or something. So I think for him, it was that you get to this place, you begin to experience God, not as something up there, but something that is with you all the time. So you can take God with you everywhere you go, and pause and check in if you need to. Take a moment and say, okay, what do I need to do next in this moment? So this idea that you had this connection that you could take with you all the time was extraordinary. And even though you might have encountered someone who tried to insult you, or who was going to try to limit your activity, etc., you still had this connection to something that was greater than whoever else was around you. So I think he was one who had the desire that everybody should have that. Have that realization that they are a holy child of God, that they are worthy by virtue of the fact that they exist. You have to earn your way into work with God. And he felt like that's what Jesus was really teaching. Or other, some of his teachings got distorted into something else.
Yeah.
That his true message was, you know, your basic worth has already been determined by God. You don't have to earn that.
Yeah. Yeah. And what an act of beautiful resistance in a culture that wants to tear other people down for all different reasons, to live in that space, both of the inner authority and this, like that deep knowing of who you are and your value, and the joyful defiance against the culture of despair that wants us just to give up. You know, what a, yeah.
Well, and I've been encouraging people more recently to pay attention to their inner life.
Mm-hmm.
You know, who's in control of that?
Yeah.
Right? You know, as a spiritual companion, you know, I had somebody last year say they were screaming at the television. I'm like, well, why are you screaming at the television?
Mm-hmm.
Who have you allowed, right? Who have you allowed to enter your inner sanctuary and disrupt your peace and joy that is a gift from God?
Mm.
You're giving the power away to somebody here.
Yeah.
And so you should be the only person in charge of your inner life.
Yeah. Gosh, what an incredible message for I'm thinking about all the angry drivers and people, you know, road rage and all the moments when that would be such a gift. Well, thank you so much, Lerita, for being with us. It's really an incredible gift that you've given us by helping translate some of Thurman's ideas for our time. And I just appreciate your apparent depth of, you know, contemplative practice and presence, you know, that comes through so clearly just in how you are and how you speak of Thurman's incredible wisdom. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you for inviting me. You know, he has a few books of meditations.
Mm-hmm.
Meditations of the Heart is one, which I always recommend people begin with. But he's got The Inward Journey,
Mm-hmm.
Centering Moment, or Deep is the Hunger.
Oh,
So
yeah.
he's got quite a few sort of prose poetry kinds of books.
Yeah.
And I'm actually in the middle of writing a book about him as a spiritual companion.
Oh,
So what would it
fantastic.
be what would it be like to go to Howard Thurman for
Oh,
spiritual direction companion, right? So what would
oh,
he do? So,
yes. So when is that book coming out?
well, I'm still writing, so
Yeah.
it will probably come out sometime in 2022.
Yeah.
I'm under contract with Broadleaf Press, so we'll
Great.
see. But I'm sort of trying to do the deep dive now. I keep eliminating activities so that I can really focus on getting it finished. But
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, well, I'm so glad that you were able to make a little space for us then.
No, this is a great opportunity to again expose him to more people.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure as you both have read, you know, you read some of these meditations and you just have to sit for a moment.
Yeah. Yeah.
And take it all in.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I definitely want to include some of those other titles you mentioned. And then you also said there's an archive of some of his talks, right? His sermons that we can actually listen to his voice, which I think would be amazing. I haven't taken the time yet to do that, but I plan to. So.
Oh yes, and I mean, listening to his voice live is the additional gift, right? You know,
Yeah.
you've already got the words and things, but then to hear him actually read some of these or talk about some of these.
Yeah, a sense of his presence. That's wonderful. Oh my goodness. Well, we've been talking about Meditations of the Heart by Howard Thurman, and this is our featured book for June of this year. And thank you so much, Claudia, for being my regular partner in I'm not going to say crime, but in contemplative explorations. And thank you so much, Lerita, for being with us today. It really has been such a joy. All right.